Yes.
Yep. You want me to let him in?
Yes.
And record. Excellent.
Lauren, I have a slight complaint. I didn't read your whole email. I just read the headline, and I thought I was going to get a cupcake today, and I have to wait till tomorrow, which is very
Correct.
upsetting to me.
Sorry to disappoint.
And for those of you just joining us, we apologize for the cupcake discussion, but there's an important young man's birthday party coming up tomorrow. So.
That's right.
Dr. Heim has very specific legislative priorities. centered
That's right,
around
which
baked
include
goods.
cupcakes.
That's right.
And frosting.
Can't leave out the frosting. Okay, well, looks like we've got most people in from the waiting room. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another one of our advocacy updates. The first of ours in December, and the first one, as Mark pointed out this morning, since Thanksgiving. So it's been a little while since we've all gathered together and taken a look at the legislative news happening in the state. So we've got a lot for you, and we're going to try to get right into it. As always, if you have questions about anything as we go through this afternoon, drop those into the chat and we'll try to get them answered. Some of them will be answered based on the points of conversation we've already got lined out. But if we see something that we need to bring up, we will get to it the best we can. Today is going to somewhat function like a year in review, but really set the groundwork for what the legislative policies are going to look like moving into 2021 and set some framework around what we expect from the legislature as we move into the new year. So Scott, we want to start with you. We had legislative leadership elections this week. You'd been looking at those for a long time, but now we know who's going to be running the legislature. So who won those races and what do you think that means for the upcoming session?
Well, I'm sure most of you know this, but I'll just review some of the changes in the top positions in the legislature. And I hope you can hear me over a printer that's going off in my room. But anyway, in the Senate, Senate President, the new Senate President is Ty Masterson, a Republican from Andover. He was elected without opposition, and he replaces Susan Wagle, who did not seek re-election. The new Senate Vice President is Rick Wilburn, a Republican from McPherson. He was elected in a race against Molly Baumgartner and Dennis Pyle. He replaces Senator Longbine, who did not seek re-election to a leadership position, but who still remains in the Senate. The new Senate Majority Leader is Gene Suellentrop. He's a Republican from Wichita, and he was elected over Senator McGinn, a very veteran legislator. And he will replace Senator Jim Denning, who did not seek re-election. So the top three posts in the Senate are new in their positions. That would be Masterson, Wilburn, and Suellentrop. On the Democratic side, not a lot of changes except at the very top, Senator Dinah Sykes from Lenexa. You may remember she was a Republican turned Democrat. She is the new Senate Minority Leader, and she replaces Anthony Hensley, who had been in the Senate for probably, I'd say 2/3 of the population of Kansas has been born since he's been in the Senate. But that's a lot of legislative experience gone. Another new position, a new senator, Jeff Pittman, a Democrat from Leavenworth. He's going to be the minority caucus chair. Those were the major changes on the Democratic side. In the House, top House leaders are basically the same as last session. Speaker Reichman, House Speaker Pro Tem Blaine Finch from Ottawa, and the House Majority Leader is Dan Hawkins from Wichita. On the Democratic side, same. Tom Sawyer, still the Minority Leader. There is a new House Assistant Minority Leader, Jason Probst from Hutch, and he was elected over Valdinia Wynn. And there's a new House Minority Whip, Stephanie Clayton. You may remember her, another Republican who turned Democrat, kind of in that Johnson County changing demographics there. So basically, in the GOP caucus, we have a rightward shift, and the GOP's large majorities improved in the House, stayed the same in the Senate. Both chambers have enough votes, if the Republicans stick together, have enough votes that they could overturn vetoes by Governor Laura Kelly. Last session in the Senate, Wagle, Longbein, Denning, they kind of represented the spectrum on the Republican Party side, but now we have Masterson, Wilburn, and Sullentrop. That's a very right-wing group, and this will undoubtedly have impact on policies that we support and oppose. And Mark, Leah, would you care to comment on what some of those policies might be?
You know, I think I might let Mark do that, but I wanted to note that we do have some brand new legislators and some veteran legislators on the Zoom today. So thank you all for being here and welcome. Go ahead, Mark.
Surely want to welcome you. We want everyone to be aware of that. We usually get a lot of compliments about legislators in this space. So, feel free to keep those coming in the chat if you like. We're happy that people are joining us, and we do it. And again, this maybe underscores, when we always sit down to assess what a new legislature looks like, remember, a lot of what determines how legislators act and respond to is what they're hearing from their constituents. So we appreciate those joining this from a statewide perspective. For all of you school leaders, it's critical you be having these conversations with your local legislators. I always say, to me, the number one issue that I think has defined our work in the past with more conservative legislators is a higher degree of skepticism at times about some aspects, at least, of public education, whether it's funding, how we spend our money, results. I'm never going to say it's an anti-education viewpoint. I'm going to say, though, it often comes with more questions, more skepticism, and an idea. Tell me the way it is and why. And I think that's something we clearly have to remember with a new group of legislators coming in. Even though some of our new senators have been in the House, it's a really important time to establish those relationships with your local senator and representative and inform them about the issues we're dealing with and positions of why. I think one thing that we'll be watching very clearly is how the legislature responds to we're going to talk about some of these a little bit more, how they respond to kind of the budget issues we have, which are still going to be challenging, not nearly as bad as it looked a few months ago, what impact that might have on school funding under the Gannon settlement. Senator Masterson, for example, I don't think it's any secret, was not a big fan of that change, although that did pass several years ago with fairly strong support in both the House and Senate. And the plan is really in place. It's a question of whether it'll be funded. I think likewise, we're going to see a more openness to some issues around school choice, funding of private schools, options like that. Again, we're going to talk a little bit more about these as we move on. And then finally, I think we're likely to hear continuing discussion about the role of the courts, probably most notably early on around the abortion issue and the Kansas Supreme Court issue a few years ago. But that plays into questions like judicial selection, which has to do with how the court is chosen. And of course, people on the court are the one that ultimately make rulings on things like school finance. So I think those are a couple of ways that we're going to be, in my view, what it really comes back, we have to redouble our efforts to explain all the aspects of public education that we're concerned about and our position on issues. Don't take for granted that people understand where we're coming from. Anyone want to add something to that? Our team here? Okay. Austin, you're muted if you're trying. Austin, you're muted.
There we go. It had to happen eventually, right? That's a great summary there, Mark, of some of the issues that we'll be looking at in the legislative session and how some of the shifts in both caucuses might impact that. One of the ways we keep track of the issues we're advocating for or against at KASB is through our pathways, which kind of isolate many categories in which we advocate on behalf of our memberships. One of those important pathways is to create and support safe and healthy schools. And Mark, we saw some sizable news on that front this week, including new gating criteria from the State Department of Education and some new CASA policies on winter sports. So what did we hear from those two bodies and what are the impacts of those?
Right. This is probably the big headlines of the week, and as always, we'll invite you, our audience, to put questions in the chat if you have any. Probably the biggest news out of the State Board of Education to start with is a change in what they call the gating criteria, which is the state board's advice, and it's only advice, this is not binding, on when schools should be in an in-person setting versus a remote or a strictly hybrid. And the main change was, upon the recommendation of an advisory committee of medical personnel, medical professionals, State Board is now recommending that districts have in-person education for elementary schools, no matter what the community spread is or other factors, if all personnel in the building, students and staff, are wearing masks, and if they can maintain a social distance. And if the school facility does not allow all students and staff to be socially distanced, then their recommendation is to use a hybrid model, perhaps of morning and afternoon alternating, but let the kids be in part of the time, or use a cohorting system where you have groups of no more than 5 that are kind of isolated together, but don't mix with the rest of the population. So I think this is really driven by, despite the continuing concerns about the pandemic, the concern about the academic, emotional, mental health consequences of having our youngest students not in school, coupled with the fact that the younger students seem to be the least susceptible to the disease or to be at least become ill, and the least likely to spread. So that was one critical decision. Again, this is not binding. This is still a decision that local school boards make, but those that are following the guidance would see that. Second thing, and then I'll let others jump in, that was not a direct state board decision, but the Kansas State High School Activities Association modified a rule that they had adopted just about a week or so ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, that was for a period of time going to basically ban spectators, allow winter sports to go forward without spectators. The decision was to allow a limited number of spectators per family. Again, it's important to understand this rule creates districts can be more restrictive than this rule, but they can't be less restrictive than this rule. And I think this is kind of an insight of just our ongoing frustrations as a state of figuring out what our policies should be. There were obviously some schools supporting this as represented on the Activity Association board, some opposing it. And then kind of the last thing I'll mention, I think, and then open up a little bit for discussion. Well, 2 other points. The state board did decide to offer districts the option of substituting the required number of hours that you have to teach to allow districts to have a 1-for-1 substitution for teacher professional development days or parent-teacher conference days. The concern is that many districts front-loaded all their professional development days to kind of prepare for this year, and they're out of those breaks. I think the concern over the length of time with no breaks, the concern about the need to kind of learn what we've learned and retool was a concern that was brought by a number of people. So what the board has basically said, districts still have to follow that 1,116 hour rule, but you can not have an instruction day or hour and switch that for professional development 1-for-1 up to a maximum of 20 hours. So this is not unlimited. There's a limited period of time to do this. I believe starting the middle of this month through, I believe, April, which is kind of the normal spring break period. Lastly, there's some discussion, as I think you all know, as we're on the verge of having an approved vaccine, of where educators fall into the priorities. The state board adopted a position asking to make that a high priority. That again is not binding on the people who will make that decision, but it's where they weighed in. So offer to let people put questions in the chat and then see if Scott or Leah has anything to add.
Yeah, so Mark, a couple of clarifications for me. First, we had an opportunity to talk to the advisory council for KSDE at our Wednesday Lunch and Learn. If you weren't able to join us for that, the link to the recording of that session is in the chat. That was a fantastic session. They did a great job of walking through their rationale and their experiences. So we got to hear from, I think, 4 doctors who are advising KSDE on those gating criteria and policies. To clarify on the Keisha ruling, Mark, that ruling was to allow 2 parents or guardians per participant in the activity?
I believe so, but I'm going to see if Scott or Leah need to correct me on that. I at least was kind of watching the state board and heard the report.
I think that's right. Mhm.
Okay.
So two, yeah, parent or guardian per family was my understanding.
Okay. And then we do have a question in the chat, Mark, specifically about the State Board of Education. We've got several new state board members, 2 new members coming on in the new year. So how are we anticipating any changes to the priorities of the state board, or do we think there will be changes to the priorities of the state board with a new body coming into place?
I don't think people are expecting really dramatic shifts. One of the new members in Johnson County is a Democrat replacing a Republican, so might take a more, I guess, traditional Democrat or moderate position on that. Replacing Steve Roberts, Mr. Roberts, who served 2 terms, kind of had some different views on things like teacher licensure, but those rarely prevailed. The other slot in the Wichita area, Kathy Bush, the Republican, was defeated by Betty Arnold, the Democrat. Kathy Bush was a Wichita USD 259 Wichita administrator, and Betty Arnold was a USD 259 board member. So again, although a party switch, I don't know as we're anticipating a big change in philosophy in that slot. So I don't think, at least early on, we see any kind of major shift. State board has usually been, there aren't a lot of issues where it's really close. Of course, there was the one this summer on the delay, but I don't think, it's not like there have been 2 closely balanced blocks always at odds and one may switch.
Another question related to the state board, Mark. They worked on the proposal to align spring breaks between K-12 and higher ed systems in their meeting last week. What was the result of that conversation, and where did they fall on that proposal?
Well, they endorsed a common spring break that would apply to K-12 and to higher education. But again, that's not binding. So it's really saying we like the idea of having this, that it would be easier if you've got kids in post-secondary programs and families and teachers, but it's still going to be up. Local boards are still in charge of their calendar. So this is something you can consider, but it would not be binding and would probably not be able to do so without legislation to require it.
Okay, Scott, Lee, anything to add on those?
I don't think so. Thanks.
No.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Scott, we also saw some news this week from the Governor's Equity Council. What did they discuss, and what are you watching on that front?
Well, yesterday, the Governor's Commission on Racial Equity and Justice issued its initial report, which focused on policing and law enforcement in Kansas. And the report included a segment on school resource officers, which I think would be interesting to a lot of our members. It kind of went over the pros and cons of using law enforcement officers in school buildings. Some data indicate that a disproportionate number of minorities are being arrested for minor offenses by SROs, while others see SROs as providing trust and safety in the buildings. So one of the recommendations of this commission is that it said, if you are going to use an if you are going to have an SRO, make sure that you have counselors and other professionals handling discipline issues. This commission was appointed by Governor Laura Kelly as racial issues kind of recently rose to the forefront after the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And this commission is co-chaired by Doctors Tiffany Anderson, who's the superintendent of Topeka 501, and Shannon Portillo, who is an assistant or associate dean at KU. And the commission also includes Dr. Anthony Lewis, who is the superintendent of the Lawrence district. So this commission has a heavy emphasis on education, and its next report will deal more with racial equity in education. And in the category of ongoing efforts regarding student safety, I'll just add one more thing. The state board and the legislature, probably as they have for the past couple of years, will be working on bullying, anti-bullying issues. And so this is something we need to keep on top of. As you may recall, a blue ribbon task force on bullying last year issued a report. This year, the state board had a mental health advisory panel that worked on implementing some of the changes that recommended by the task force. So, and this focused on training and resources and improving school climate. So the legislature has shown a lot of interest in this issue, and it may be worth your while to let your legislator know what you are doing as far as anti-bullying goes in your schools.
Scott, any indication that what comes out of this report or this group's work might influence some legislative priorities in the new year?
Well, the State Board of Ed has made, they kind of have a long list of legislative priorities, and this bullying is among that.
Okay, very good. Mark, Leah, anything to add on that report?
Just emphasize what Scott said. There's a long-standing legislative concern about bullying issues, kind of the feeling that at least some schools aren't doing enough. We've always been concerned as an association, although certainly opposing, bullying and wanting to address it, that kind of just passing a new law requiring more reports may not solve the problem, that we really need a more comprehensive approach. That's what the state, the Blue Ribbon Group and the State Department are looking at. How do you really change the climate in a school to be effective? But I think it's going to be incumbent on schools to demonstrate that they are, in fact, being effective and being responsive, because if not, I think there will be continued pressure to say, hey, you're not solving the problem, so we're going to have to step in and add some new requirements.
Agreed.
Okay. Well, Leah, we'll turn to you next. One of our other pathways here at the association is a focus on civic engagement. And so we had some news from the state board, the State Economic Recovery Committee, and ongoing efforts to increase broadband access in the state, which we know you've been watching closely for about a year now. So what kind of news are we hearing out of those groups?
Yes, I think I'll focus on economic recovery first. The Special Committee on Economic Recovery met earlier this week to kind of wrap up its hearings for 2020. And there was quite a bit of discussion in the committee about the need for better alignment between businesses and education, not only folks, but between business and K-12. The sentiment is that students should know as they're progressing through their academic career, as they're matriculating down the field, as we might say, that they will have a good, high-paying job after they leave high school or after they finish college. And so, there was quite a bit of discussion about, we have too many people leaving Kansas. That hampers our economic success if we have people leaving, particularly the types of people that we know. Generally, Kansans are seen as good workers, good work ethic. It's a great place to live. We want people to stay here. And so there was some discussion about the need for better communication between business and education. And that we know is something that has been a focus of ours and of the State Board of Education for quite some time now. And as a corollary to that, or really something that even kind of overtook that discussion, was that, we're not going to be able to expect people to stay in Kansas for jobs or to continue to work in Kansas in the current remote working and remote learning environment if we don't have better broadband infrastructure and access across the state. And so there was quite a bit of discussion about we need to have better rollout. We've had all kinds of mapping issues. We have a broadband task force. We all agree that this is a good thing, but what are we going to do to make it happen? Part of the challenge in the rural and kind of the more expensive areas for broadband is that it's hard for businesses to make the case that they can, to spend the amount of money that's needed to get that out to the last mile subscriber. And so, there was discussion about, the state government's role in broadband, perhaps subsidizing some things in order to make it more attractive for folks to roll that service out. Some questions about, what happened with the Kansas Universal Service Fund, which is similar to the federal service fund, which the federal Universal Service Fund funds some broadband efforts, but again, not enough to help us in Kansas, where we have about, I think the last count was about 156,000 students without adequate broadband internet access. That's about a third of our enrollment in Kansas. Those are kids who don't have that access. And so I think we will see some recommendations from economic recovery, not only around better alignment between business and education, but hopefully some additional legislative support for expanding broadband in Kansas, not only for education, but for the overall economic health of the state.
Mark, Scott, anything to add on the work of those two bodies?
I think Leah covered it well. As you know, this is something that has been both a federal issue and a state issue, and it certainly transcends education. And some of the Spark money is going in this direction. Some of
That's
you
right.
watching may be involved with school districts that have partnered with others around this. So again, I think it's critical to keep doing it. I think the one thing to keep in mind is there really are two issues here. One is, can the home of the student or family, do they have access to broadband?
Right.
And do they have the technology? Can they afford the technology
correct.
to access it? So it is both sort of the infrastructure across the state and places that don't have it, but it's also making sure it's accessible. Some of our urban core areas also struggle with this because students still may, even if it's available in the community, the family can't access it.
That's correct.
Well, Mark, bringing up some Sparks funding is a great transition to one of the next points that we've been watching closely the last couple of weeks. You in particular took a look at the reallocation of some of the Sparks funding that can't be used as it pertains to early childhood education and did a real deep dive into the enrollment numbers. So what have you learned as you explored those topics, and what do you think it means for our school leaders as we head into 2021?
Well, the one comment, and I don't know whether to be surprised by this or not, the Sparks Committee, which of course, if you're new to us, this is really the process that was set up between the legislature and the governor to make recommendations on how we would use the over $1 billion in federal COVID aid. A portion of that was allocated to basically provide supervisory care to students who are not in school, whose schools are not operating in person, but are having difficulty with, their parents are working. What do you do? So some dollars were set aside to do this. Now looks like some of that money, a fair bit of that money that was kind of set aside a month or two ago, isn't going to be used for the simple reason they can't spend it in time, because this chunk of money all has to be spent by the end of December.
Mark, I'd like to interject real quick. Senator Tom Hawk, who's on the Spark Executive Committee, is on the Zoom today. Senator, this might be a good opportunity. Did you have anything you want to add about what Mark just said?
My apologies, I didn't hear all of it, but he's, as usual, Mark is correct. We had a Zoom meeting yesterday on Spark, and he's correct. That childcare money was not going to get spent, but the State Finance Council has said any money that is left over that's not spent, if we can actually determine that accurately by December 30th, would go into the unemployment fund to cover some of that. So there may be some other things in terms of some flexibility that was put into that third phase of spending that money, but it was looking like either the need or the ability to spend that money, as you said, on the childcare pieces wasn't going to get done. And of course, the big question is, what is Congress going to do? And of course, the feds change the rules fairly frequently, so they may change that December 30th date, although I don't think they will. But you never know with the state of affairs in DC.
Thank you. It's good to be found right, at least sometimes. So The other issue that kind of around early childhood that I found very interesting, the State Department of Education a week or so ago, or at least we found it a week or so ago, posted the new enrollment numbers for all public school districts. And you may or may not know, private accredited schools also report their enrollment numbers to the Department of Education. Non-accredited private schools, which would include homeschools, do not report these numbers. So we have a universe that includes all public schools, accredited private schools, which we estimate to probably be a little bit less than half of the non-public school enrollment. And then there's another group of students that we really don't know much about because data isn't provided. We knew that public school enrollment was expected to be down. School district budgets that were turned in had anticipated that. It did turn out to be down about 3%. What surprised me when we unpacked a little further is it was not at all uniform across grade levels. In fact, for public school districts at least, most of the decline was in pre-K, school district daycare programs, at-risk pre-K, special education, early special ed, 3 and 4 year olds, and kindergarten. And the next largest group was basically grades 1 through 4. So what we found was that it appears to be the youngest students, including many who are not required legally to be in school under the compulsory attendance law. And interestingly enough, that was very similar to the pattern for private schools. There were kind of two differences. There was a little bit larger drop for our private accredited schools at the high school level, and there was a pretty big drop for public schools in what are called non-graded students, which are basically adults in like diploma recovery, dropout recovery programs who are not in kind of our regular high schools. What we didn't see that I think some people were perhaps anticipating is that frankly, public school parents that were frustrated because they weren't getting on-site learning transferred to the private schools. That didn't happen, at least on the accredited side, and it appeared to not really happen very much, at least at most of the upper grades, because we didn't see that big a change. So we still don't know all the reasons why. And what does this mean? Well, I think there's some concern that if these students are not in quality early childhood pre-K programs, that tends to set you at a disadvantage coming to school, but it may also mean that there will be a longer time to kind of catch up. In other words, a student who's sort of losing academics as a junior and senior may have more difficulty catching up by the time they would be scheduled to graduate than these younger students. So we don't know, but that to me was really interesting information. And we have posted a blog on that if you want the details that kind of goes into this in a little more detail.
And I'll throw the link to your blog from last week into the chat. It goes into some great detail and showcases those in graph form so you can see the comparisons between both those private and public schools and where the drops have been. Something else everyone's paying attention to right now, in particular because of the potential impact of COVID, are staffing issues. We got a report from CAPERS last week regarding an uptick in retirements, but also an update on the solvency of the fund. So Leah, what did we hear from CAPERS and what are we seeing in the retirement levels and as we look ahead to staffing issues that might come up in 2021?
Well, Austin, I'll just very briefly discuss that Executive Director Alan Conroy, who many of you know is kind of the icon of CAPERS and a recognized expert, said the fund is in great financial shape. It's meeting all the actuarial predictions that it needs to do. As he said, all the stars have aligned. And so actuarially, the fund is doing very well. They did note that the number of retirements in the school group, so the school folks who take advantage of CAPERS, that has gone up. The retirements have gone up about 28% since the fall of last year. Anecdotally, that he said that's because of health concerns about teaching in the pandemic, and also concerns about well, actually some employers had offered perhaps some early retirement incentives, and so while the rate of retirements was up by about 28% from last fall, It's a little too early to tell what that will mean for next year, but regardless, the fund is in excellent shape. And he said public employees do not have to worry about their hard-earned dollars. In a related note, he did mention, and the legislature was very happy to hear about the fact that Capers waived over these past several months the requirement that school employees wait 180 days before returning to work in a Capers covered job. As you may know, teachers or superintendents might retire, and then after 180 days, they're eligible to be hired back to teach in a different school district, or perhaps a superintendent might fill in as an interim in a school district has a vacancy. Because of the number of vacancies that have arisen due to illness or other concerns with the COVID pandemic, Capers went ahead and waived that 100-day waiting period, which schools and others really appreciated. The legislature applauded Capers for kind of taking that step, and said that they would probably make a recommendation that that ability to waive the waiting requirement continue for a while here during the pandemic, and then they can kind of put that back in place when the situation warrants. So some good news for state employees on Capers, and for flexibility for school districts who are looking to hire qualified folks during the pandemic.
Mark, Scott, anything to add on staffing or Capers?
No, not from me.
Yeah, Leah covered it well.
Fantastic. Funding is always a place of focus at this time of year, and as the legislature gets ready to get going. Mark, it seems to be that the big news this month is that the Gannon ruling has already informed where we're setting the school finance budgets for next year, but that's a little more nuanced than it might appear at first glance. So what does the outlook look like for school funding, and where might that be headed?
I'd love to tell you there's just a real simple way to explain all of this. So I'm going to give it a little bit of a shot. So one thing to keep in mind, everybody remember that the Gannon decision, the legislature really responded in two ways. It fully funded, and has to this point fully funded, equalization formulas for things like local option budgets and capital outlay and bond and interest. And it adopted a 6-year, ultimately there will be a 6-year set of staircase steps for base state aid per pupil. The legislature has approved those, so they're in statute. But for districts to actually get the money, every year the legislature has to make an actual appropriation. Last spring, the legislature not only funded the current year we're in, but they made an appropriation for next year. Most of state government will be waiting for this year's legislature to set a budget based on what the governor recommends. For base state aid per pupil, the biggest part of our aid, that money has already been approved and appropriated, but it is subject to adjustment. So on one hand, basically the money for the Gannon phase-in has been approved for this year and next year. Number two, I mentioned earlier those lower enrollments. So here's another thing a little complicated. For the regular enrollment of a school district, last year's enrollment is used to determine this year's student count for funding. So part of that loss in enrollment that we had this fall will not affect this year's budget because we're still using the prior year, and we can actually go back further. But weighted students, which are the add-ons that we provide for students in certain high-cost programs, that enrollment is based on the current year. So for example, if we have a free lunch eligible student, a free lunch eligible kindergartner that was there last year that didn't come back this year, we're still in effect counting that as one student for the budget, but we're not counting them for at-risk weighting this year. As a result, the legislature will actually save about $20 million below what was already appropriated last year. Now, does that mean school districts are losing $20 million? Well, you're losing $20 million from what was expected. you're not necessarily losing anything because base state aid, remember, is going up for next year. So districts will be getting more money per student in base state aid. Many will be getting less than they were expecting because enrollment is down in terms of weighted students. So hopefully that's real clear. What I think is going to happen, though, we need to be very aware of is that legislators, because the state continues to face a deficit in the general fund, and K-12 is the biggest part of that general fund, there's going to be a lot of questions about how have changes in school district operation by having almost a quarter of last year, we were not on site. Many legislators are saying, well, did you save money? You weren't running buses. Maybe you didn't have as many people employed. What savings did you have? This year, we know districts have been in and out of different enrollment operating environments. So there's going to be questions about, were there savings? Second, I think most people understand there may have been a limited amount of savings. And one reason it's limited, don't forget, is because the legislature directed school districts to continue to pay all employees. So people weren't fired because the legislature didn't want that added to our unemployment, and that's where most of our costs go. Most people also understand that the costs associated with COVID have increased, whether it is buying more hotspots for broadband services, whether it is more masks and PPE and more cleaning supplies. Another critical issue is substitute teachers. To talk a little bit about what Leah said, we understand the numbers also say that school district staff are down a little bit from last year. I think that goes into that report that we had more retirements, but some districts are saying they've already spent their entire year's worth of budget for substitutes, and we're not even halfway through the year because so many people either didn't fill positions or more people are out with quarantines or whatever. So it's going to be really critical for schools to demonstrate what's happened to your budget. If you had savings, where and what did you do with those dollars? If you had additional expenses, what are they, and to what extent are they covered by the additional federal aid that all districts received, the roughly $84 million, and what, if anything, did you get from your county, again, under that Sparks process? This is going to be complicated because counties were very different in how much they gave to schools. Some counties gave a significant amount of their allocation from the state for educational purposes. Some have not reported providing any yet. And so that's going to mean how much those expenses are covered are going to vary significantly. Last thing, and then I'll see if there's any kind of questions or comments. We also know that a big question of legislators many years has to do with our cash balances. I guess was just earlier this week. See, the days run together when you're working from home. Legislative post audit was directed by the legislature to do a study of cash balances, and they basically made a report with no recommendations. They did not find any problems. What they basically said is neither the legislature or the state board has really given any direction to school districts, and so districts have very different policies. Overall, we find that cash balances, we believe at least, are pretty much in line with what government accounting experts would recommend for either cash in reserve or cash you need to have for cash flow. Some districts are quite high, some districts are quite low. So this audit did not come back and say, boy, we found a lot of things that are not being done correctly. They also basically didn't make a judgment as to whether there's some level that is too high or too low, and that could come into to play this year in the legislature as well. Let me see if Scott or Lee has anything, and see if there's any questions that came up.
There's a question in the chat. You want to go to that, Austin?
Yeah, so Chris asked a great question, and any or all of you can weigh in on it, asking if the association's anticipating any changes in the special education categorical aid reimbursement rates this year. Specifically, a curiosity about how or if lower numbers of paraprofessionals have any impact on that rate this year, next year, and how that's all calculated.
You know, that's a great question I haven't thought of, but as many of you know, most of the special aid formula is distributed on the basis of teaching units. So one reason that the per pupil amount or the per teacher amount comes down is if we add more teachers than we thought. So if we have fewer teachers than we thought, then that per teacher reimbursement could go up. But I have not heard any estimated changes. Remember, that changes throughout the year. So it may not be till next spring that we have a better sense of in the current year where we are. But that's a good point. If we have fewer people, the amount per teaching unit goes up. And again, maybe for our legislators who may be new, every special ed teacher receives a flat amount from the state, and then their 0.4% of that is provided for every special ed para. But because the legislature provides a fixed amount, if there are more of those units, that amount goes down. If there are less than expected, that amount goes up. Anything to add?
Anything to add?
Nope.
Well, I just heard Mark say he heard a question he never thought of, and that's hard.
We don't get that very often, do we?
Great question. Something more to worry about.
Okay. Any more questions there in the chat as we kind of wrap up our list of topics to cover?
I would like to touch real quickly on some kind of breaking information regarding the federal landscape. Senator Hawk mentioned we're kind of keeping an eye on what's going on in DC. I wanted to let you all know the National School Boards Association, which is our parent group, just issued an action alert just before we got on this Zoom today. And they are, again, urging Congress to include much more funding for K-12 education than currently is being sort of envisioned in stimulus talks that, frankly, we're looking great. We've been saying this for 6 months, this week's the week, and right now it's not looking so good again. Although the Senate did just a couple of minutes ago pass the stopgap funding to keep the government open for another week. Yay us. But we still have a long way to go on the stimulus. And so I think the level that is kind of being contemplated in these stalled stimulus is about $85 billion for K-12. NSBA is asking for $200 billion for K-12, including $175 billion for education stabilization. And they're asking for $13 billion for IDEA, that's special ed, as you know, $12 billion for Title I, and $12 billion for broadband for fixing the homework gap funneled through the Federal Communications Commission. As you know, earlier in the spring and fall and summer, we were talking more about $3 or $4 billion, and the studies are showing we need closer to $12 billion to help fix those broadband access and equipment gaps that we see. And we also are seeing an effort in Congress to tie some of this stimulus funding or other funds to either vouchers or tuition tax credits for a couple of years as the pandemic continues to exert its grip on public schools and whether they're open or closed. And so there is thought to be an effort in Congress to kind of funnel some money to private schools or to homeschooling expenses if public schools are not able to stay open. So as of about 2 hours ago, Senator Pat Roberts was quoted as saying that it wasn't looking good, that we were going to get a stimulus by Christmas. Representative Sharice Davids, who represents, I think, many of you on the call, if you're from kind of the Kansas City area, she expressed cautious optimism that something would happen. Speaker Nancy Pelosi said earlier in the week, we can keep talking through Christmas. So my point in all of this is that it would be extremely helpful for you all to contact Senator Roberts. He's on his way out, but he's still got a few days left. Senator Moran, and that you're member of the House of Representatives, and ask them to include these higher funding levels in the stimulus that apparently is probably not going to happen like today, but it still could happen. And they really need to hear from you about why this funding is important. So thank you for letting me interject there, but this all kind of popped just as we were getting on the Zoom.
Yeah, it's been an incredibly complicated process to try to track and follow, and we appreciate you doing yeoman's work in that effort, Leah.
Could you see me like checking my phone every few minutes?
Well, Leah, I think we have a question from a friend of yours, whether you've got
Yes.
any insight as to whether the FFCRA leave provisions will be extended past December 31st. Does that
It's not, they haven't really, they did not call for that in the action alert. And I don't think that's addressed in this stimulus that is being discussed, but you know, there is quite a bit of work to do yet here before Congress adjourns. And you know, another thing that might happen, as Senator Hawk kind of mentioned, there's a possibility they could extend that December 31st CARES Act funding, you know, through September of next year. So, you know, September of 22. So there are a lot of things that are still in play. And we really would urge you all to contact your members of Congress. Sorry, Lou, I know that's not very helpful.
Okay.
Don't shoot the messenger, I guess.
That's right. Okay, any more questions from our panel? Team, anything else you'd like to add? Scott, I know you're observing State Finance Council this afternoon is planning to meet.
Yes, I believe they have on their agenda to extend the disaster declaration. So we'll see how that comes up. And just as a final word for me, is great to see everyone, and especially thank you to the legislators who came on board today.
You know, I'll just on that would say we are hoping that we will get to see our legislators in person, but we really don't know what the format is going to be or what will be allowed or when coming into the session. That's one of the things I think the new leadership team will have to be deciding. So we don't know how many Zoom meetings or Zoom hearings or testimony we're going to have to do, and we promise we'll try not to barge into your office and spread pandemic. So we're waiting for what those are, but I think that kind of makes it all the more important for our members across the state to kind of help us by having your own relationship, virtual or otherwise, with your local leaders. This may be a very different session in terms of our ability to communicate, share concerns, and so we're going to have to be maybe more deliberate than we've been in the past. But I'll echo Leo. Thank you for legislators that have joined, and if you enjoyed this, you're always welcome to join and tell all your friends. And if you didn't, I guess, sorry, we'll try to do better.
We'll try to do better. That's right.
Mark, a quick question in the chat from Senator Hawk. Confirming or wondering if special ed state money totals won't change even if there are fewer staff reimbursed?
It's an appropriated amount. So for example, the money for this year was a $7.5 million increase from last year, but that's a fixed amount. Mm-hmm. That's what I'm saying. If the number of teachers goes up or down, that the amount per teacher varies, not the amount, unless the legislature would do something about that.
Okay, well, not seeing anything else in the chat. I want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. Mark, Leah, Scott, as always, we appreciate your time, your insight, and your knowledge. We're looking forward to the legislative session and getting that up and running. So thank you for your time today, and we'll see you all soon.
Thanks, everyone.